Have you ever been expressing your thoughts online? Maybe talking about how you enjoyed Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, but it has a few flaws. Say how some of the areas are very bare bone, or how it disappointingly repeated basic bosses from the base game. Just little thoughts like that. And suddenly, the DLC is perfect! Stop complaining! Casual! Skill issue! Get good! Get good! Get good! Yeah, if you're not prone to thinking things are perfect for just existing, I'm sure this sounds very familiar. But how did we get to this point? If you've been around the Souls community for a long time, it definitely feels like this kind of discourse has reached a new level of toxicity that wasn't quite there before. So what's different? Has the community really changed? Or is it yet another case of vocal minority? Let's get into it. Hi! So trying to identify whether the community has changed is a bit of a difficult task. If you've interacted with the community at large at some point in the last few years, I've no doubt you've seen firsthand some very opinionated people. Especially given how often discussions like, do Souls games need an easy mode, happen. Which of course, brings out the best people. So that's enough to see that there definitely can be some toxic people in this sphere. But has it always been like that? We need a complete picture of how the community was back then. Now for context, personally I started with Dark Souls 2 sometime in 2014, but I never finished it. It was only until summer 2015 where I got and beat Bloodborne. From there I went back and played some of the prior games, and played every game in DLC at launch after that. But I would say that it wasn't until a little bit after Dark Souls 3 launched that I started to get a little bit more involved with the community. But obviously that means that I wasn't there early on, or at least early enough to make any judgment. Because of that, of course, I needed some help. So I asked a few people who have been around a lot longer than I have. Maybe you know them? So I asked them if they personally felt discussions early on mirrored anything that we see these days.
There was a Demon Souls forum. It doesn't exist and it hasn't been archived to my knowledge or anything, so sadly we can't really go back and look at what those conversations looked like. Yeah. And then eventually I was just posting on Reddit right when like Dark Souls 1 launched as well. And it's hard to say how stark of a difference there was between then and now.
There was very little information on this game at that time. You learn pretty quickly, like, oh, if I dodge, I don't take damage. You know, I can't attack if my green bar is empty. Like, there are things that you just pick up if you've never heard anything about, like, a Souls formula on your own. But there are also things that you don't pick up. Like, knowing that diminishing returns kick in at 40 is like, how would anyone know that?
Yeah.
No, there were no wikis yet when I played. So when you looked up information, pretty much the only source was GameFAQs. And someone would make a forum post being like, how do I put my Mercury Stone in my rapier? And someone would be like, oh, you have to upgrade to +6 or whatever the number is. So it's hard to say in terms of criticism because everyone went into Demon Souls with the perspective that the game was unfair. So it was like, if you come in to GameFAQs and you're bitching, then people are just like, well, why are you playing the unfair game then? You know, so it wasn't so much like get good as much as like know what you're in for when you get into this. So they were very helpful, and there was a community. It's hard to explain. I think it was ultimately just the size. There were far less people there. Mm-hmm. So when a new person posted, you're like, oh, someone new is playing Demon Souls for the first time. And so it was like, it was an interesting, novel thing. Whereas now, like, in regards to Elden Ring, which of course the player base is just massive.
I do feel like things have gotten a little bit more toxic in terms of, sharing your opinion out on the blue on Twitter might get you all sorts of nasty feedback. But part of me wonders, it's like, I don't know if people have actually just sort of gotten meaner with that, or if it's an exposure thing, right? If we have these algorithms in place now that sort of reach an audience more broadly than we used to in the conversations we have. So maybe people would have been just as unforgiving back in the day, but I think maybe we were existing in our own pockets a bit more. So what I can say is that, yeah, I don't remember those interactions happening as much back in the day. Mm-hmm. Trying to gauge the vibe shift is a bit tricky, because it's like, to what element is it a shift in attitude, and what element is it a shift in sort of technology and the way we interact online?
Some people that don't know what they're in for when they play Elden Ring, like maybe they just think it's like an Assassin's Creed, or it's, some other like AAA game where they're like, okay, I'm just going to, pop this in and it's going to be challenging for a bit, but I'm going to have a narrative, story-driven experience and I'm going to watch the credits. I don't think they fully anticipated like, oh no, I'm going to make it to Stormvale and not be able to beat Godric. Like I've heard so many people that played Elden Ring for the first time and didn't make it through Stormvale. And so I think when they get the like Git Good shoved in their face, it makes them mad, obviously. Whereas I don't think that necessarily Elden Ring is harder than Demon Souls, but when someone went on GameFAQs and said, hey, I can't beat Phalanx, somebody would say, oh, it's okay, try using fire. Or it was the way that people respond to one another, and that all has to do with the size of the community, I think. Dark Souls 1 changed it somewhat because it launched on Xbox. So there were a bunch of Xbox players that had never heard of Souls that got to join the community. I mean, if you if you watched any YouTube videos of Dark Souls 1 back then, when I say back then, I mean like 2011 to like 2014, 9 times out of 10, it was recorded on an Xbox because the 360 had such a larger install base in the PS3, right?
Yeah.
So just if someone has a console from that generation, it was probably an Xbox. So if someone is making Dark Souls videos, they probably played it on Xbox, as opposed to you can only play Demon Souls on PS3. So by factor of it being exclusive, it's just gonna have a smaller community overall. So I think it certainly grew. I don't know that the attitudes about the game necessarily changed.
Before going any further, I do want to state that unless I'm explicitly presenting their own words and thoughts during the interviews, everything in this video is my own opinion. So the takeaway from these interview segments is that the size of the community and the limited places the discussion took place, primarily in forums, kinda limited the discourse like the ones we see today. And the internet environment certainly is much different now than it was back then. That's not to mention that these styles of games were new at the time. I imagine most people in the forums were just out there fighting for their lives trying to get through the games first and foremost. Because players didn't have 15 years of experience on this style of combat yet. Now during Dark Souls 1 is when a lot of the early Souls content creators started to get a foothold. I'm talking your epic name bros, your German spies, your Soulsborne guys like Piven Ouroboro, your Vadividjas, and of course IllusoryWall and Phobia. So a more wide net of attention was starting to reach places outside of the gaming specific areas of the internet. And just in time too, because Dark Souls 2 does appear to have at least shaken things up for the community. Dark Souls 2 specifically is definitely an interesting one because, I get the impression that Demon Souls fans just like Dark Souls 1 just as much. It's a pretty similar game, even though there's differences and stuff. But Dark Souls 2, yeah.
I was gonna say, yeah, you definitely get people who like will stand Demon Souls or whatever and be like, yeah, that's my favorite game or whatever. But like the amount of people who like love Demon Souls but hated Dark Souls 1, like that's a very like almost non-existent. That'd be a tiny fraction. Like you said, they're mostly on board. It's to anyone, if one of those two games was like S tier for you, the other one was not worse than A- probably.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Dark Souls 2 was the one where there was a more sudden break in opinions, of course.
Yeah, is there anything noteworthy for that? Because from my understanding, there's definitely like there could be what a lot of people like to call like recency bias of a new game from a dev you love. You just you enjoy it maybe the first time, but maybe later on you come back to it or something. It's just like was there anything like that or anything of like people immediately being on the like yeah, I'm not into this on from the first.
Well, I was in the beta for Dark Souls 2. And I'm trying to think of a way to say this that doesn't make me sound like an asshole. I think I'm just going to sound like an asshole. I don't think I have any way to say this. I played the beta, and I enjoyed it because it was Huntsman's Cops. And it was way different in the beta. And there were far less enemies, and there was no poison butterflies, and the final boss was the Executioner Chariot and not the Skeleton Lords. Then I bought Dark Souls 2, and I was like, this game sucks. And then I made it to Huntsman's Cops, and I was like, well, at least I'm going to have a fun area. And then I was like, they changed it. I hated Dark Souls 2 day one. I never liked it. I thought it was slow. I thought it was clumsy. It had terrible item durability. And that is like one of my pet peeves in games is when items break. So Dark Souls 2 was very frustrating to me. And it taught me a lot about the community. Because when Dark Souls 2 launched, if you were there in 2014, I think it was, that everyone was just glazing Dark Souls 2. When it came out, the universal opinion was this game is better than Dark Souls 1. Everybody thought that. And it took a solid 6 or 7 years for people to finally admit, like, okay, I like the game, but it does have problems. And that taught me people get blinded by novelty. Whatever the new game is, they're going to like because it's new and because they haven't, it's like you just described, they haven't figured out the meta yet. The fun is finding the meta, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't think you can really trust people to have a candid opinion when a new game launches if that game is good or bad. I think you have to wait years to find out, at least as a community. Of course, you can have your personal opinion.
Yeah.
My personal opinion never changed, but I know a lot of people's did. And it taught me something about myself also, which is I don't mind playing the same game over and over and over. So the novelty aspect doesn't affect me as much. And I think we're even seeing a little bit of that with Elden Ring. Because, obviously when Elden Ring came out, people were just amazed by the scope of the game and, just some of the enemy behaviors and all the boss fights and all this sort of stuff. And on my my most recent Elden Ring upload, it has comments saying, more Dark Souls 2 too. And I was like, whoa, are people actually like, is Elden Ring beginning to get a negative opinion? I don't know. But I guess what my point is, if Elden Ring does end up with a negative opinion, it will take years for that to be uncovered.
Like as a whole, you mean? Just
as a whole, right?
Yeah, in the same sense as Dark Souls 2, yeah.
Yeah, and also, that's not to say that, like, obviously you're allowed to have opinion that differs from the community. I have that a lot, but
yeah.
My point is just if you're talking about like the internet as like a choir of people that just chant nonsense,
Yeah. Like basically, it'll take a while for everyone's opinion to settle without nostalgia bias or not recency bias rather.
Yeah, I think a big thing for me on that was just adaptability. I don't think I fully knew how much adaptability mattered for iframes, so I was just getting hit a lot during rolls, which made me mad. And now that I do understand the way adaptability works, I think it's dumb, and I still don't like it.
Yeah, like you hate it more almost, reason. I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The backlash for Dark Souls 2 was pretty immediate because of things like the early teasers pointing at like having much better graphics on computer and more interesting lighting.
Yeah.
So like when that was all kind of stripped down, like people were unhappy from the get-go. On top of, all the differences of, iframes being tied to a stat, the general feeling of difference in controller, like it was definitely an alienating experience. I think Dark Souls 2 is a cool game. I like it. Now, I do definitely agree with a lot of the criticisms that were sent its way, but at worst, that always just knocked down a few pegs.
From the two different discussions, it'll probably sound like there's a discrepancy between Illusory's and Phobia's perspective, but I don't think there is. Here's how I understood things. IllusoryWall was talking about there actually being some infighting in the community on the disagreements of the quality of Dark Souls 2, which even if it wasn't many people, even to me who came in later, it did sound like there was a good chunk of people who didn't think much of the game at launch, or even shortly after release. And Phobia's talking about it more at a macro level, where perhaps the community at large, or maybe even just general fans of the game, did glade Dark Souls 2 for at least a good while, before the general consensus of the game did start to shift a little bit more on the mixed side after enough time passed. These two statements can coexist. I mean, Phobia himself not liking Dark Souls 2 does at least show one example of someone who deviated from the popular opinion. But there was a broad scope of people who did like the game. And among them, maybe some were indeed just mesmerized by the new FromSoft launch. It is worth noting Dark Souls 2 did indeed get a lot of positive reviews from journalists and the like, still somewhat to this day. But if you're in the community enough, you know now that the game is very divisive at the very least. And of course, it is entirely possible that people were indeed glazing the game to oblivion, and that's what frustrated a lot of the disparagers of the game. But even when taking that into account, neither of them gave me the impression that the disagreements would be boiled down to Git Gud comments or anything of the sort. We're talking about people inside the community who likely knew each other and just had differing thoughts on the new game, rather than people catching strays from random fans online for the most part. Because I do think some of the comments we've heard from them so far as to the nature of the internet and algorithms changing is a big factor in this discussion. So while I'm sure it would get heated, it didn't sound like people were outright dismissive of each other's opinions. And it certainly didn't sound like people stopped being friends from this or anything. Or I would sure hope not. Bloodborne was a little bit of a return to form for the community, not so much because it was more like Dark Souls 1 or anything, it's obviously quite different, but I do think it had more general praise for what it was. Like, there are people who didn't like it as much as Dark Souls because it's still different, and some people just prefer the setting and RPG elements of Dark Souls, but at the very least it was still a different IP. So I don't think people were necessarily expecting more of the same in the same way that they were Dark Souls 2. So despite there being occasional differing rankings of the game, let's say, I think a vast majority of people think it's a good game for what it is, if anything. What I can say, because we're sort of reaching the point where I started being a fan of the series, and can speak with more authority on this, is that while it was viewed generally positively, I don't think it immediately had the borderline legendary status that it seems to have now. And I mean this even after the DLC came out. I want to say this general sentiment of considering it a masterpiece of a generation started to sort of surface around 2019 onward. I feel like that's when I started to notice it more blatantly. And while it's among my favorite games too, I do think it's a little dangerous how overhyped it's getting. I feel like it's going to reach Ocarina of Time levels of overhype to where it almost becomes borderline impossible for the game to live up to the hype for anyone who hasn't played it yet. But anyway, somewhat of a tangent. I think in the grand scheme of things, Bloodborne wasn't much of a factor in this discussion. I think people at the time mostly liked it, but acknowledged a few flaws it had, such as the challenge dungeons maybe not being as fleshed out as it could have been, for instance. However, I do think we're approaching some key points in the timeline. And I do get the impression that a lot of people, whether they change their opinion or not later, were definitely a little bit like, had the initial hype, the recency bias as I like to call it, and then after that, or maybe on rare occasions, some people just immediately were like not on board. It took a while, but some people definitely had to fight that, whether it's to fight against people who liked it or just their own. As time went on, like the more they had to realize, oh, maybe I don't like this as much as the previous one.
Right.
Yeah. So it's yeah.
Is this where we get into Dark Souls 3? Because there is no way for me to talk about Dark Souls 3 without just immediately outing myself.
That is the next question, more or less, if you want to just jump into that. The next one was like, have you felt the shift in how the community responds to criticism? So we can go from there any way you like as well.
I think Dark Souls 3 was that shift, yeah.
Yeah. I can't express how much to you Dark Souls 3 was a game changer for the community and the series as a whole. While Bloodborne is seen now as a beacon of a game, it didn't actually sell that well, relatively speaking. Obviously, it being only on PlayStation 4 is a big factor, as to this point there hasn't been any big console sellers on the PS4 yet, and the top games at the time, like Assassin's Creed Black Flag, GTA 5, and The Last of Us, were also on different consoles, so it wasn't necessary to buy a PlayStation 4 for them. But this is also talking about at the time. It's probably sold a more reasonable successful number by now. But if we put it in the context of Dark Souls 3, which sold over 1 million copies in the first week, that was unprecedented numbers up to that point for FromSoft. It was the first game in the series that felt like it got mainstream attention in the same vein as very established game series. So obviously it brought in many new fans as the first Soulsborne game. Now on top of that, because Dark Souls 3 followed more of a Bloodborne style combat than prior games, it was pretty much predestined to garner different types of fans in the first few games. Phobia and I had a pretty lengthy discussion about the differentiations.
Well, just for me personally, I was right there with you, right? Like, Dark Souls 3 is coming out. It's going to be great. Like, we just played Bloodborne. Bloodborne was fantastic. Bloodborne is my favorite game of all time. Now we're getting Dark Souls 3. This is going to be amazing. Pre-ordered it, stayed up until midnight for it to launch, started playing it the moment it dropped, right? I'm so excited. I did not like Dark Souls 3. I did not finish Dark Souls 3.
Oh, wow.
I thought Dark Souls 3 was a bad game. I thought it was copy-pasted assets from Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, and that the lore didn't make any sense, and that the areas were bad, and I thought the bosses were sloppy, and I thought the damage numbers were too big, and it was overly punishing. And for many, many years, I did not have anything positive to say about Dark Souls 3 at all. I won't say that I left the community, but I definitely I was more of a consumer for a while because of Dark Souls 3. And today, I have a slightly different opinion of Dark Souls 3. I appreciate it a bit more. I think people unfairly criticize Dark Souls 2 for things like you go up the elevator in Earthen Peak, and then you're in a volcano. But if you look in the sky, there's no volcano there, and like the way the world connects and stuff, which I think that's a fair criticism. It could be a bit better. Dark Souls 3, the whole game is like that. Like, can we please talk about like when you go into the forest to then go down some stairs into the catacombs to then come out at the top of a mountain that is now Anne Orlando? Like, what are you talking about? Like, no. You are not allowed to criticize the world of Dark Souls 2 without also criticizing the world of Dark Souls 3. The interconnectivity of Dark Souls 1 and like the way Lordran was stacked on top of each other is just untouchable, in my opinion. But I don't think the world building is everything.
Yeah.
The thing that knocked me out of Dark Souls 3, the reason that I had so much trouble getting into it for years, was how much damage attacks do. And I don't just mean on you, I mean on enemies as well. And this is my biggest criticism about modern Souls, if you want to call it that. In Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 and even Dark Souls 2, every stat matters. And you can make a build that is all dex or all strength or all magic or whatever you want to do. In Dark Souls 3, the only stats that matter are vigor and endurance. You can put stats into those damage dealing, or put levels into those damage dealing stats, and it will increase your damage. But that damage does not matter. If you can just swing twice, you will do more damage than having, 40 strength or whatever on your hammer. I hate the way that they adjusted the algorithms and ratios and stuff in modern Souls to make it so heavily encouraged for you to have like 40 plus vigor. When I play old Souls, I usually don't level up health at all because you don't need it. And I don't know. That's a big issue that I have. When I went back and realized, like, oh no, this game is quite playable if I have 40 vigor. But if I have less than that, it's just suffering. Elden Ring is also that way. I don't like that about Elden Ring either. But I just, first thing I do is grind out some levels and get a bunch of health. And it's like, okay, well, now I can take hits.
Yeah.
I wish scaling was a bigger deal. And I wish the numbers overall for damage, both that you give and receive, were lower. Unless you just have like crazy 99, like in a stat or something. Like you should be able to get there, but you should have to really put effort into it, I think.
Yeah, I don't think that's even like if you put it the way I'm about to, like, I don't think it's a controversial thought or opinion. They definitely are more action than they are RPG after a certain point. And
exactly,
you could argue Bloodborne was kind of that because it's somewhat similar there too, but there's also less stats and stuff, so it kind of consciously did that. Dark Souls 3 onward, they kind of cosplay as an RPG, but not in a sense.
I hadn't thought about that. It actually is possible that Bloodborne is also guilty of that, but because the regain mechanic is there, like you get hit and you can jump in and get your health back from it. But I think without that mechanic, Bloodborne might severely suffer. So I think I might agree with you there.
Yeah.
Also, I'd like to say the community has been trying to solve this issue. Like if you ever, follow Ouroboros on Twitter or anything, Oro is constantly saying level vigor. Every comment, every tweet he makes is level vigor, get 40 vigor, get 50 vigor, get 60 vigor, please level up vigor. He's trying to like not only help the community, but help PvP especially, because the game doesn't tell you this. But if you have less than 40, you are going to struggle.
Yeah, I see Peeve do it as well. Like I definitely see him on occasion do that, and I know he sometimes gets a flashback against that, even though I don't know. I think it's just understanding the mechanics and how it would fit the prior games more if you level vigor right off the bat at least or something.
Right.
Yeah.
I criticize the game for requiring it, but I don't criticize like Oro and Peeve for promoting it because like they're just trying to help people out, obviously.
Yeah, exactly, and it's playing with the cards you have basically. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And I can get into it also. Like, when I make a glitch video or whatever, and it's like, I don't have to like a game to make a video about it. I'm just kind of, you just rewire your brain. You're like, oh, I got to go this way with it. But if we're talking about my personal opinion is that I wish having so much health wasn't a requirement.
Yeah. So Bloodborne, at the very least with Bloodborne, even though people did realize it kind of is similar enough to a Souls game that they put it together as a Soulsborne, where, Sekiro later wouldn't be. But yeah, like it definitely there's less stats. It's pretty much is only health, endurance, and then any damage that you want, essentially.
True.
So it kind of doesn't role play as an RPG as much as Dark Souls does. Well, Dark Souls is an RPG as well, but like Dark Souls 3 later, they kept the RPG kind of aspect to from Dark Souls, but has the combat speed and a lot of the aspects from Bloodborne, but it just didn't mesh as well in some regards anyway. Like, I know some people prefer the game, and that's fine. But I guess, like, if you're looking at it from a perspective like people like us, where we liked those aspects of Dark Souls 1 and whatever, it sounds like we would just prefer it if they didn't even try to make it an RPG at that point, in a sense. And you can maybe argue that's why Sekiro is really cool. I don't know what your thoughts on Sekiro are, but like, at the very least, it focused on action almost entirely.
Yeah. Well, I love Sekiro.
Yeah. Okay.
But if Sekiro didn't have the I forget what they call it now. The like the skill tree where you buy moves. I thought that was like integral to that game.
Yeah.
Obviously, the deflection is what makes it.
Yeah.
But if I wasn't like grinding XP for something, I think I maybe would have lost a little interest over time. And the funny thing about it is the moves don't really matter. Like, you have Mercury counter, and then the rest of them you can kind of do without.
Yeah. What happens when you get an unprecedented number of new fans to join the community when the style of games changes from the prior ones? Simply put, a divide in the fan base forms. The community can be a pretty broad term to begin with anyway, but I do think this is when things start shifting. And by proxy, and as what we stated earlier, I do think this is when the shift on how we handle criticism starts to happen. Mind you, I don't think we're fully there, nor do I think this is the sole reason why the shift started happening in this time period. I think to have a full picture, we need to remember what year Dark Souls 3 came out. 2016. In my head, as someone who's been on the internet for more than half my life now, 2016 always felt like a year where the internet shifted, and shifted in a more openly hostile direction, not just the odd teenager being edgy on gaming spaces. I do think the 2016 US election is a big part of the reason. I think that brought out a lot of emotions out of people due to the policies that were being proposed at the time, and how much the internet felt comfortable in voicing opinions they otherwise wouldn't have. On a more directly related note, I do think Gamergate was also probably a big factor in how online discussions changed in the gaming space. I should acknowledge that this happened a little while before Dark Souls 3. Bloodborne theoretically could have been affected, but as I said, due to the fact that it didn't expand the community as widely as later entries, the effect wasn't noticeable yet, if it was there. Illusory has also voiced some passing thoughts on what he thinks could be a factor too with the algorithm talk, which we will dissect a little bit more deeply later on. There could be other factors at play that I don't know about, and I know this is gonna come across as just a trust me bro moment if you weren't there, but even if the year was off by a bit, I feel like you probably felt that too. And to be fair, I don't think I recall the Git Gud style toxicity getting thrown around in the same vein as it is now, quite yet. Or at least that's what I thought at first. We're gonna look at something in a few minutes that sort of made me take that back. But the cycle where some fans were predisposed to being more overly optimistic about the new game is certainly at play here as well, despite whether their opinion shifted later on or not. I don't think the public view of Dark Souls 3 ever shifted as strongly as Dark Souls 2 did, though it always had detractors of course. That'll certainly be a recurrent factor, but I think only increasing in intensity. You have to realize that until now, we've gotten a new mainline FromSoft game every 2 years, sometimes one, and sometimes less than that if you consider the DLCs were often released within a year timeframe as well. And if that short gap is enough to make fans rabid for the next release, what would it look like when the gap is around 3 years without any From Software content? Well, I think most of us know what that looks like. You likely lived through it, especially with Elden Ring and Shadows of the Erdtree, and it wasn't always pretty. Okay, so to tackle the actual phrase in question now, let's rewind time a bit once again and actually dissect what Get Good used to mean versus what it means now. The most reliable website of all time, Know Your Meme, state that this phrase in some way or another has been around as early as about 2008 or 9, stated as being used to heckle inexperienced players, and checking their sources, there's claims that it was used in the game Metal Gear Online and Call of Duty, predictably. So most likely used in innately toxic ways as is common in online games, especially shooters. But then of course it says that it was eventually adopted in the Dark Souls community, and that's probably where it's most recognizable for most people today, where it became a prominent meme. Of course, I asked the boys what their experience was with this phrase. What did the phrase "get good" mean back when it was first used?
I'm glad you brought that up because I was actually going to I don't know if this is a hot take. I don't know what the consensus is on this. I've seen some people try to defend it as saying that it used to be more of an affirming, encouraging thing, and that it's turned more toxic over time. I don't know if I agree with that. I think it's always been both. That's my sort of perspective on it. I think you have people who kind of say it jokingly because they went through that experience themselves. It's kind of a lot of people bounce off these games at first and fall in love with them after like really forcing their way through it. I've seen that argument put forward where people felt like it evolved into a more toxic thing. I think it's always been both. It just depends on the context. Sometimes people mean it in a negative way. Sometimes people mean it in a joking way. And then in addition to that, if you're the recipient of that kind of stuff, these are strangers online talking to you that you don't necessarily have a rapport with. Someone might be saying it jokingly and you might take it negatively. And that's not totally anyone's fault. That's just sort of the outcome of people, just the chaos of talking with strangers online. But I do at least have the opinion that people should not jump to that, just because it can be, even if you don't mean it in too harsh of a way, it can be interpreted that way. And then, of course, if any people do really mean it in the toxic way, Get Good, that's just like, shut the hell up. I hate that. Yeah, no, it is overall leans more in the toxic direction. Again, there are people who can say it jokingly and it can be interpreted, I had to Get Good too, depending on the context of how you say it, it's not always a bad thing. But it does turn out that way a lot of the times, and especially anytime it's used to shut down criticism. Of course, that's innately toxic in that context.
Okay, well, the only way that I can answer this question, obviously, is how I interpreted the phrase when I first heard it, right? Mm-hmm. The way that I saw Get Good most often in terms of the first times that I saw it posted, I don't know that was ever really a GameFAQs phrase. I don't know that it's something people said a lot when Demon's Souls was the current game. I think that was more of a Dark Souls 1 thing. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they meant it in a hostile way. I think what they meant was, this is an action RPG. So make sure you have light load. Make sure you have a 100% physical block shield. Make sure that you're using only one damage type on your weapon, or that your stats are, heavily benefiting your magic or fire, whatever your alternate damage type is, then Get Good. And I think basically what they meant was like, here's all the things you need to do to optimize your build, but at a certain point, it has to be practice. And I think Get Good used to mean it's okay to die. Just don't give up, But now I think Get Good means put a decade into playing these games like I have, and then maybe you'll be as good as I am. Look how much better I am than you. Mm-hmm. I think now it's a teasing thing. It's entitlement, and it's a superiority thing.
To add to their perspective, I was told a good way to put it from someone who wishes to remain anonymous for the video. They said originally the phrase was a tongue-in-cheek comment, though some people did use it unironically. And yeah, I think that's about right. Because all you need to understand to know that to some degree it's an unserious phrase, even if some people's intent is maybe close to zero in that department, is look at the spelling. Obviously that's not how you spell the phrase Get Good, not to mention it is intentionally a clunky phrase, so calling it a meme is accurate. And it is worth remembering that the Souls games are primarily single-player games, so I do think the nature of how it was used in that context was at the very least a little bit different. But, as established, even if a few of the comments vary and the intent of use even originally, we collectively agree that it still feels like its meaning has changed a lot for people in the last few years. That's definitely telling. Whether it be Get Good or skill issue, that being a more recent succinct way that the same sentiment has been expressed, the underlying problem is the culture of elitism that has formed. I mentioned earlier something about Get Good not being as wisely used in Dark Souls 3. Well, look at this graph! Yeah. If you don't know, this is a Google Trends chart that indicates how much any given prompt has been Googled in a certain time frame. Dark Souls 3 was literally the all-time highest search for this term, and every other noteworthy spike is another FromSoft release. Now looking at this graph, it may seem that the usage of the phrase may have decreased after Dark Souls 3, but I don't think that tells the whole story. Once again, this is a trend for people Googling the phrase Get Good, meaning they're either trying to look up what it means, look up something related to that, like a meme or a video, or maybe searching the origins or where it's used most. And my reading of it is simply that people don't need to look it up as much. This phrase has just become a common used meme that people kinda get at this point. This is just conjecture, of course, But I don't think it'd make much sense that it wouldn't be used as much after Elden Ring was an even bigger release than Dark Souls 3, and when Shadows of the Erdtree alone sold more copies in the first week than Dark Souls 3. And it's extra frustrating when you're talking about things that feel like they're unnecessarily turned up to 11 and beyond in terms of difficulty, seemingly just for the sake of said difficulty, and people dismiss as potential criticism as just you needing to get good, and not being a flaw with the design. I would say it's gone to the point where there has formed a really big dissonance between the fans and the visions of the developers. Because hell, do you not realize that even the devs disagree with you? If the devs really wanted you to get good and put no thought beyond that, why would they allow summons of both NPCs and other players? Why would they add spirit summons? Why would they add the Scattered Tree fragment system in the latest release? I mean, Miyazaki himself has said that he sucks at these games, and he uses a lot of these tools. Are you going to tell him to get good? The community has really become a parody of itself when spouting out this get good line unironically. And it sucks a bit too on FromSoft's side because the twisted reputation these games have formed have become sort of a thorn on its side. And I have one very particular example to demonstrate this. Tell me if this situation sounds familiar. You're playing Dark Souls 1 and you just got out of the asylum. You drop onto the bonfire and the only place you seem to be able to go is through the graveyard. So you go through there, you get your butt kicked by some skeletons, you keep dying to the skeletons, but you think to yourself, these games are supposed to be hard, that's what the games are about, right? So then you persevere, but then you go down to the catacombs themselves and it becomes even worse at that point. If you're playing any other game, the difficulty of this area would have tipped you off that this isn't the way to go. But because it is Dark Souls, and the tagline is prepare to die, oh no, it's probably the way to go, it's just hard. And in fairness, this is more of a Bandai Namco problem than FromSoft problem. FromSoft themselves aren't too overt on the difficulty thing. Bandai definitely pushes it more as a marketing thing, maybe save for Dark Souls 2, which did play into the difficulty angle in the game itself. But we know the story there, it wasn't a Miyazaki game. It's certainly highly possible that in any given instance, people may decide to tackle something way out of the level range and simply brute force through it, for better or for worse. There could be some legitimate achievements from defeating a boss under-leveled, but for your average player, not sure how much that would hold up. But just for proof that FromSoft themselves in theory aren't all about difficulty, let me read you a few quotes by Miyazaki in interviews. This one is after the release of Demon's Souls. Our intention wasn't specifically to make a difficult game. We first wanted to create a game with the highest sense of achievement, and in order to do this, we needed to increase the difficulty. This one's from an article that is now taken down because it's from Game Informer, which has closed, but I used it in a video before, so I have a screenshot of it. It expands on the last quote. Having the game be difficult was never the goal. What we set out to do is strictly to provide a sense of accomplishment. We understood that difficulty is just one way to offer an intense sense of accomplishment through forming strategies, overcoming obstacles, and discovering new things. Our goal of a sense of accomplishment was the basis of the games since the early stages of development, and we never strayed from that. These next two are from Dark Souls 3. I have no intention to make the game more difficult than other titles on purpose, it's just something required to make this style of game. Ever since Demon's Souls, I've really been pursuing making games that give players a sense of accomplishment by overcoming tremendous odds. And the last one. There were of course several moments where I had to stop things and take a step back and consider the difficulty. But it's not necessarily that I say, oh, this is too difficult. But instead the term I usually use is unreasonable. So that's a term I tend to use when I have the conversation with the development team. When you think about it, the difficulty in the Dark Souls franchise so far has been something that players have eventually been able to overcome. So when I show concern to the development team members, that's why the term I use is unreasonable. Basically, we don't want to go too far. It's about striking a balance. Though these interviews make it sound like FromSoft and their original vision doesn't care how hard something is. And yes, some of these overtuned difficulty things we can see now are first and foremost FromSoft's fault for falling more in line with the difficulty pandering or failing to check and balance the difficulty. But surely we should have a limit too. If you just close your eyes and pretend everything is fair game as long as it's technically beatable, how far does FromSoft have to turn up the needle for you to realize, wait a minute, this is too much? Do bosses have to be teleporting without any more animations? Or attacking you with psychic attacks you can't see and you just have to guess when the attack comes? Do you have to understand how combo charts work? Do you have to be able to plug into the Matrix? When did these games go from an immersive, grounded dark fantasy game to a fighting game just cosplaying as an RPG fantasy world? If I wanted to play completely unfair games, I would just boot up I Wanna Be the Guy, or Kaizo Mario, or one of those Undertale Sans mods. You know, free fan games that appeal to that kind of crowd. I wouldn't be booting up a FromSoft game. Because to me, these games have always been more than just hard game. Which I hope explains my frustration when people act as if being hard is good unconditionally. All this brings us to a point that's a little bit more personal to myself, Illusory, and Phobia, and surely loads of other content creators.
I should say though, so I was never too involved in any of the more heated discussions surrounding Dark Souls 2, but 2 in particular had so much back and forth discussion in the form of video essays. Like,
yeah.
It is a weird phenomena that game had, where it's not just like, here's my take on the game, but it'll be like a 3-hour response to someone else's video essay, and then like a 5-hour response to that person's video essay, and it's like, what the hell is going on?
I think video essays will be a good way to not only expand on the previous few minutes, but also go a little bit deeper into the thoughts of media literacy. We should first acknowledge that video essays haven't been around forever. And I do think around that same era was when video essays were starting to become a thing, in the sense of like Egoraptor's Ocarina of Time one, for instance. So I know he got a lot of hate for that, because I can't really remember a time before that where Ocarina actually received criticism, like widely, and by someone as big as him. Like, I'm sure they did exist here and there, but I think even me, like, who wasn't necessarily my favorite Zelda, but I always thought of it as a good one. Like, I was like, what? You think this game is not good? I mean, I don't think he'd go as far to say that, but yeah, like, I feel like it can be traced back to around that era where there was a shift in like online discussion.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that would be the time period where that started to. It's funny to look back, and especially some younger viewers might not remember as much because they probably just grew up with this sort of content. But like, video essays like didn't exist previously.
No.
Like that was like that. They weren't a present thing in our culture. It took a few different angles of getting there. There was stuff like every frame a painting, which is related to movie discourse, was like a big leap off point. It was already happening before that, but there were a couple like big sort of moments of like, oh, like this is a thing. People like longer discussions about things.
I understand that things such as video essays on YouTube can be a bit tricky. If you see a thumbnail and title that seems a little exaggerated, let's say, you have to wonder if it's their actual opinion, or are they disingenuously trying to clickbait me? Which, by the way, I should clarify, I don't think all clickbait is bad. If you're only a consumer of YouTube, you have to realize that whether you click on a video or not sometimes determines our livelihood. So obviously we will try to optimize how many people click on a video on this sometimes relentless algorithm. But there is a limit. If someone's outright lying to you about the contents of the video with how they package the video before you click it, there's certainly reasonable grounds that it is scummy, especially if it's a video aimed at younger audiences. So I know sometimes video essays have been used in a way that sort of muddy the waters and could make you think negatively about them before you even watch them. Like, yeah, I'm sure there's people out there that post contrarian videos and takes just for engagement.
We have also learned as a society the monetary value in making content that is like intentionally controversial.
Yeah, polarized or negative,
where you intentionally take a take that is the minority to get hate clicks and, to generate comments that way and to get interaction and all that, because a view is a view is a view, and it all makes money.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying that like Aaron, was trying to do that with Ocarina of Time.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't have any idea.
Some people do, is my point.
But for videos that actually put effort into them, and as long as you unplug your ears and go blah, 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 there's probably some perspective you can gain from it, even if you disagree. Assuming it's expressed well and you have some charitability. With all that said, if this is your first time coming across my channel, there's something important you should know. I did not like Shadows of the Erdtree DLC. Perhaps there are some subtle clues to this in the video, but only now do I find this information relevant in order for you to understand my perspective in this discussion. The long and short of it for me, I think too many of the key issues that the base game had were not only not addressed in the DLC, but doubled down on, such as areas being way too big, seemingly just so the scope of the map seems impressive, and not to include more noteworthy content in it, along with some areas not even being that big but still being borderline empty. Countless repeated bosses, not only from the DLC but from the base game too. I didn't find a lot of the new bosses that interesting or well put together, some really pushing the limits of what would be reasonable, as Miyazaki puts it, difficulty-wise. And I didn't find any of what we now call legacy dungeons to be anywhere near as interestingly put together compared to prior DLCs, games, or even Elden Ring itself. Do I think there are positives in it still? Of course, but not enough to be a redeeming experience for me, personally. If you want to hear my expanded thoughts on it, I have a ton of videos that go into it in my Elden Ring critique playlist. And for the record, I do like the Elden Ring base game. Now, if you made it up until this point in the video, and only the things I said in the last minute or so got under your skin, and you're tempted to comment on it, for your own good, I beg you to listen to the next part. for this topic at least, I would hope that people. I mean, I do feel like this happens this probably happens for everyone at some point. Like maybe like people who came across my negative videos, for instance, were younger and maybe haven't been around the block on YouTube enough to hear the words that probably every YouTube essayist has said, like, you can criticize something you like or whatever, or you can criticize something, or someone else can criticize something and you can still like it. You know, just basic things like that doesn't detract from your experiences or whatever. Like,
Yes, thank you. Yes, that is very important.
yeah, like
That
that's
is a lesson that many people still have yet to learn somehow.
Yeah,
I
and
don't know
unfortunately,
how we haven't figured it out by now.
I mean, I think that's the thing. I think people have learned that, but because there's so many people who come into YouTube like with a game eventually, like in this case it would be Elden Ring, like maybe they weren't as active before until they got into this community, quote unquote, and then they saw criticism of a game they actually liked, and they're like, oh, how dare you.
Yeah.
And hopefully eventually they do learn this lesson of like, yeah, no, you can like something and still criticize it. That doesn't mean it's a bad game per se. Some people may say that. That doesn't have to make you change your opinion on it either. Like
Right.
it's more complicated or more nuanced than that, I guess I would say.
Yeah, a pretty big maturing point in having some media literacy is just not getting too mad when people disagree.
Yeah.
Again, in spaces outside of video games, I can think of stuff like movie reviews, right? Like sometimes people get really upset if a critic doesn't like something that they liked or whatever. But I think something to just remember at the end of the day is like, there's no one in the world that you agree with 100% of the time.
Yeah.
No one. You know, like, I think of people who have really closely aligned tastes with me. Like one of my brothers, right? Like if he says to like, watch this, you're going to like it. There's like a 99% chance I'm going to love it. But even then, every now and again, there's just something that we don't agree on. And like, that's normal to have this sort of attitude where you're just going to get angry at someone for disagreeing. It's not worth it. And it's a fundamentally immature way of interacting with media criticism.
Yep, pretty much, yeah. Yeah, like that's a pretty good point too, just in general. Like, I would say that there's probably very few things, and you know, that'll probably be on the political side of like, you know, like you don't have to agree on everything to get along and stuff. But you know, I guess for stuff like this, yeah, that doesn't matter. It's just
Stuff like this. For stuff like this, yeah,
it's
yeah,
video
yeah.
games.
Definitely bigger things to be concerned about and angry about. And it definitely speaks if someone's spending a lot of time in discourse getting really angry about video games. It's not that they don't have other valid issues in their life, because they probably do, but it just shows like a skewed priority, right? Like they're getting really mad because someone disagreed about something in the video game, but it's like an ambulance ride costs $1,000 because you live in the United States. There are other things to be upset about.
I'm only saying this next part because it all came up in the interviews, so they're okay with it being stated on air. But just as proof of what was just discussed, Phobia didn't like the DLC almost at all, just like me. We're definitely in sync there, but Illusory definitely was far more receptive to it. He knew I didn't like it, we still respect each other just fine, and we're willing to work together for this video. Hell, I'll put it a step further, and more clearly. I doubt either of us give a shit about each other's opinion on the DLC to any significant degree. We know we agree on far more important things, more important than the subject of this video even, but we'll certainly both agree that this toxic cesspool some people in this community take part in is a problem that should be addressed. And I guess for Phobia too. It's not just that we both dislike this DLC that makes us think this is important. Now, to address the bigger issues topic, you could ask, why do you spend so much time criticizing video games when there's bigger fish to fry then? Well, for one, I would like to make a game one day. There's a few ideas that I've already sort of tossed around in my head and have written down plenty of details about them. So doing these kinds of videos are both a way for me to exercise game design thought processes, and hopefully a way for people themselves to consider something if they found themselves not liking, or liking for that matter, in a game. I also just enjoy thinking about things critically and analyzing them. I mean, I personally enjoy watching video essays myself for reasons like that. My favorite channel of all time, definitely one of my biggest influences in video creation, is Matthew Matosis. He's an early example of the video essay format on YouTube, and I find myself being in sync with most of his thoughts, or at the very least I can follow and understand his perspective. Now, he's definitely smarter and more knowledgeable of video games than I am. He'll go into deeper detail about topics that I have thus far, but I would hope I'm making my way there as well. As for the bigger fish, I mean, I try to do my part in my own day-to-day private life. Sometimes I'm vocal about that on Twitter. These things don't have to be mutually exclusive. It's just that this YouTube thing has become my occupation, which I do enjoy, but I do try to do my part in society too. As much as I can anyway. I hope we can agree that there's a lot of systemic issues that currently are out of control, unfortunately, and are decided for us. But to get back to the point, as you could predict, a good chunk of my videos that have a negative slant to them regarding the DLC have a good amount of dismissive Git Gud comments, and things of that nature, all throughout. I would say especially as soon as I drop the videos, as subscribers, now likely former subscribers, saw it in their feed, or seeing it in the recommendation feed or whatever. And that was their gut reaction, without listening to what I'm saying, but there's still occasionally dismissive and passive-aggressive comments here and there these days. And of course, the nature of them not being open to discussion at all. I mean, I featured a good amount of them in the intro of this video. As you could have guessed, those are my comments. Now, as we talked about plenty in this video already, I do find those innately toxic. Because if I were to come into these videos with an inauthentic angle or something, like sure, maybe I'll deserve it, but I'm not. I didn't come into the DLC planning to hate it or something. I was just as excited as the next person, and was shocked and a little sad that I didn't end up liking it. But it did feel like I needed to voice these thoughts, especially in case there were others that felt the same way. To further put into context how nonsensical the Git Gud comments were in my case, I beat my first playthrough of the DLC in New Game Plus 7. Yep. And I say it in the intros. Did that stop people from commenting Git Gud? No. But that goes even doubly for my point, because if you had actually watched my initial videos on the DLC, the difficulty was a minuscule part of my complaints. I think I only mentioned it once in my very first video, which is the one with the highest dislike bar, and the one with the most surplus of Git Gud comments. So when I say people don't listen to what you're saying, I don't just mean it goes one ear and out the other. Sometimes I mean it literally. They didn't take the time to listen to what you had to say to begin with. Difficulty was a bit more of a poignant point in my last video after I finally beat the DLC, but that was after encountering, you know, Radon, which to my understanding, it's not uncommon to think that he's a little bit bullshit. But again, I beat him, New Plus 7, melee weapon, no cheese whatsoever, actually with a partly holy weapon, which for phase 2 wasn't doing me any favors, so to some degree I made it a bit harder for myself, but I wanted to beat him with my build, and I did, and somehow people still unironically commented it. It is pretty ridiculous when you look at the whole picture. To unironically think that if you didn't enjoy the DLC, the only explanation is that there's something wrong with you, is kinda wild. I mean, I even got this fucking unhinged comment at one point, so... As Phobia said earlier, people really do get blinded by novelty. You've seen it happen before, which is why we're not surprised that this happened for the DLC. But there's a contradiction, isn't there? A lot of people seem to not have learned from that experience either, and allow themselves to get consumed by the hype of the DLC releasing. And that's not to say that you can't genuinely enjoy it. But if you were in the action of just dismissing criticism of it without really hearing people out, I'm afraid to say you're part of the problem. Now, some people did criticize my choice to go into New Game Plus 7 for a first playthrough in the first place, which could have some merit, but two things about that. One, I've done this for most DLC I have played at launch. Bloodborne was one new game cycle shy of being maxed, but I still had a hard time. I think I spent nearly a week trying to beat Orphan, and that's still my favorite DLC to this day. And I liked every DLC after that for that matter. So I just assumed I would this one too. Which yeah, how was I supposed to know I wouldn't? Like sure, maybe it made me have less of a good time, but if I'm not having a good time to begin with, does that really make a difference? Because again, I already mentioned that difficulty wasn't even near the top of the totem pole of complaints for me, and that's the only thing it affects. And two, this brings me to why I do it to begin with. Phobia one time commented a really good point about playing these games at higher new game cycles, which I wonder if he even remembers this. I didn't think to bring it up in the interview we'd had. But he said, difficulty brings out sloppily tuned bosses and slow character movement. There's a few other small thoughts he had that were really good as well if you want to read them yourself. But this is the main point for the current discussion, and I completely agree. This will be a hard thing to explain. To some degree you have to experience this yourself to relate. But the one example that comes to mind when I think about that point is Lady Maria in Bloodborne DLC. Really cool boss, I think most people agree. Memorable encounter, a humanoid boss fight done right. Have you ever tried fighting her in Blood Level 4? If you ever have, there's a chance you might have had a completely different experience with her, because there's a lot of little flaws that come to the surface when you can't as reliably avoid her. That adds up. For instance, did you know that if you parry her during the last phase, if you parry her just a tad too late, you can still get hit by her flame attack follow-up? It's not the most substantial thing in the world during the normal run, but that's a death in Blood Level 4. Now that's not to say that bosses should be specifically tailored for a low level run like that, or anything, but are you really going to tell me that a successful parry, still being punished for not being nearly frame perfect, isn't, at best, a bug they never fixed, or at worst, just a genuine flaw with the boss? Now on the other end, an easy example in the other direction is Mesmer. I think it's pretty universally agreed he's a great boss. Maybe the best one in the DLC. Is it because he's super hard? No. It's because he's a tight boss with very well telegraphed moves. And on the contrary, isn't excessively difficult just for the sake of it. And he continues to be so in Negan Plus 7. I've been singing his praises since I met him. And this is all not to mention that there's plenty of people who didn't love the DLC and they were playing a new game as well. This point rests on the idea that playing in Negan Plus 7 is an objectively bad way to play the game, and otherwise I would have been fine with it, as flawed as that thought is to begin with. So no, I don't think being in Negan Plus 7 in itself somehow made me not like the DLC, and it's my fault. Does that mean I'm going to continue doing Negan Plus 7 on DLCs going forward? Probably not. As I said, I did this ideally to increase my enjoyment of the DLC, and if I just don't enjoy it, which is a new reality I have to tackle, then maybe I won't. At least not at first. And look, I'm not trying to say that most of my criticism are objective. I know a lot of people like to throw around that word. Truth is, very few things in life are truly objective, if we're following the actual definition of the word. In video games, most things experienced by players are subjective by nature. Instead, how I like to look at things when I try to break down why something is a good or bad mechanic or feature, I ask myself the question, what does a player gain or lose from any given interaction? I know so far this has all been anecdotal. I'll share some of the others' experience with this kind of behavior shortly, but before that I want to clarify that I'm not saying all this as some kind of woe is me kind of thing. I don't care. The comments didn't affect me that much, and I'm confident in my thoughts. I'm not gonna be gaslit into thinking something is wrong with me somehow for not liking the DLC. And I say that while being open to reasonable discussion to any given topic. Not like I'm gonna say you're wrong for liking the DLC, but I do think a lot of the behavior that was displayed during it was a problem. And I simply wanted to give some first-hand documented experiences of that kind of thing.
I guess I'm maybe more apologetic when it comes to how people used it originally. I think it was more, lighthearted than critical at first. Mm-hmm. But now I think it is almost all critical for sure. Like, for example, like when Only Afro made his Giant Dad video, mm-hmm. the point of the Giant Dad video is, I'm a PvP meta sheep. Look how tryhard I am. Laugh at me. And then people unironically took the build and started doing it in PvP. It's like, guys, no. You missed the point. The point is if you dress up like Giant Dad, you're an asshole. That's the point. Like, oh, the base cannon, all the stuff in the background. Like, he did everything he could to show that it was a joke. But yeah.
I mean, I do think that even if people did do that, they're probably in on it to some degree, but I wouldn't be surprised if some people did unironically were like, oh, this is the best build, all right, let's go. Or something.
Well, I mean, it unironically is good, is the problem. The Chaos Wire's kind of rough.
Yeah, that is a funny perspective, yeah. But I mean, yeah, that has that same energy in that it's a tongue-in-cheek critique of the community or whatever at the time, and some people took it seriously. Like it's actually the same thing.
Nuance is hard for some people.
I guess people just read things how they want to be read. I guess that's the issue, isn't it? At the end of the day.
I think that's what we're learning is you come in the room already having an opinion and you're just going to gravitate to what confirms the opinion you already hold.
Yep. Now this has been brought up here and there throughout the video as a passing note. So now let's address the elephant in the room. Social media. IllusoryWall had a brilliant way to put a name to the certain behavior that we have sort of discussed so far. Take a listen.
The negativity would have been there, but there was less opportunity for drive-by negativity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
is
not
what
like
I call it.
Yeah, not like a Twitter attack or something. Kind of.
Yes.
Happens now. Drive-by negativity is about as succinct as a way you can put it. A gut response to something you see without engaging with the idea any further. In this case, negatively, of course. If you've experienced this type of reply on social media, especially on Twitter, it probably makes sense very quickly. I'm going to let him speak a bit more on social media, but keep this comment in mind while you listen.
I've been thinking more about social media and toxicity in general a lot lately with stuff happening on Twitter and the sort of exodus that's happening to Blue Sky. It's very fascinating, the sort of ecosystem of social media to me. Like, earlier social media was more about following things you were interested in. And sure, there would be toxicity. Forums had drama. The forums had arguments, flame wars. There was never... I don't want to look back with rose-tinted glasses too much, pretending like there was a time on the internet where everyone was happy and friendly, because that's not true. But generally speaking, like the earliest days of Facebook, right? It was college students friending other college students. You weren't on there with your family. You weren't arguing with like, family members. You weren't seeing like propaganda in your feed. You were just following like friends and friends and friends and stuff like that. Early social media, Tumblr, early Twitter, you were just following things you wanted to follow. And again, there might be arguments from time to time, but it was a lot more it was a much more catered experience in the past, where you followed things you wanted to follow, and that's what you were exposed to. But social media veered in this algorithm-based direction where they're just trying to pump all sorts of crazy stuff your way. Facebook is horrendous with it. I mean, I haven't used Facebook in a long time, and Twitter as well. And it's sort of the thing that I've been thinking about lately is dunk culture, right? That's something that invites a lot of the drive-by negativity, is people just trying to sort of make fun of things they don't like or disagree with. And it's hard to know where to draw the line on what's acceptable, because it is fair for someone to call out something they don't approve of, right? Like especially if you're in a position where you manage a community or something like that, it's okay to be like, hey, what this asshole did is not acceptable, and this is not cool, and this will never be welcome in the community, right? Like there are times and places where you can and probably even should do that. But wherever that line is, I hope we sort of collectively recognize this as a society that like Twitter, where Twitter wound up, is completely not the right way of doing that at all. Making fun of things you don't like and arguing with people just gives it exposure. So I'm hoping in this discussion that we're having about like, are people a lot more negative lately when you criticize things? I think the way we constructed social media fed into that a lot, but there might be a change where hopefully that might actually happen less, depending on the platforms you use. So
there's certainly something to be said about all of that. I know for me, whenever Twitter introduced the following tab like a year or two ago, I've literally never gotten off of that ever since, because that's a lot more like the social media I grew up with, where I only see the things I want to see or my followings want me to see. And it helps stop me from doom scrolling too. Of course, I've still had my occasional annoying interactions on Twitter, because some people will still just have my post show up and they don't like it. So they do a drive-by comment or try to dunk on me or whatever. And depending on the interaction, I may be willing to have a discussion. Oftentimes just people trying to tell me I'm fundamentally wrong or what have you. So even if people like me softly solve this problem for themselves by staying in their lane, so to speak, ultimately the problem is the website will keep exposing unwanted behaviors on you regardless. Speaking of which, because neither Illusory nor Phobia post opinionated content, let's say, they haven't experienced the type of comments I have in the same manner on YouTube, even in the brief time I've been posting polarizing stuff myself. But they've still had the exposure of that kind of behavior in their own ways. Illusory has a few stories that I'm going to let him speak on for a little while.
For me, the biggest moment of being taken aback recently was when I shared my thoughts about a very specific thing in the DLC of Elden Ring, and people got mad at me on Twitter. That was funny. So in the DLC of Elden Ring, there's an enemy that has a weak point on its back, and it's clear that they just sort of ran short on development time, because they just put messages on the ground, like these developer notes that are just like basically just go for the weak spot, and it's like by the beginning of every dungeon where you can encounter them. And it's like, oh, in the base game that would have been like a note you can get from a merchant, or even the DLC had a much better version implemented of that with the there's the note you can find that tells you about the weakness of the furnace golems by a destroyed furnace golem, being like, don't, keep it away from the explosives, like, what are you doing, you idiot? Like, yeah. And you find one in the environment that was destroyed, so it's like, oh cool, you can kind of piece together, you have something you can find and put to use. But it felt like they sort of gave up there, so I was just sort of pointing out on Twitter, being like, man, what the hell is up with this? In a tweet where I said I was loving the DLC, I was a lot more receptive to the DLC than you were overall. So even as someone who wasn't really being that negative about the DLC, but was just nitpicking one thing where I thought they handled it poorly, oh man, people were like telling me to shut up, and like, yeah, it was a really weird experience. I'm trying to remember some of the other interactions we had. Maybe you can pull them up and show them in the video, but there's one point where like someone said something and I was just joking, kind of being like, oh, this is why we can't have nice things, and people were just like genuinely mad, being like, it's you saying this, you're the one like, creating the problems or whatever. And I'm just like, whoa, like chill. Like
it's rough too. Like, I understand. Well, no, I don't really understand, honestly, because I'm like, from my perspective, you're just giving a light criticism to something that's just, it feels a little rushed. It feels a little bit like needless because from my perspective, as soon as you see that spot, your brain probably, registers that as like a weak spot, especially if you're experienced in video games.
But it's also at the same time, I guess, like, the people who drive by and see that, they get this idea in their head that like they need to defend the game, and they're really upset with this mild criticism, which is just weird because, like, from my perspective, it's like, oh, if you know who I am and what I do and the way I talk about these games, like, I'm the kind of person who will talk about how gravelording is the coolest thing ever and how it also sucks. Like, I can sing the praises and pick apart the things that I don't like about these games. Well, actually, and I apologies to Iron Pineapple if I drag him into this discussion in a way that was without his consent, I guess, but he saw that Twitter thread about me criticizing the DLC, and he was like annoyed on my behalf enough about that that he said to me that like he is less inclined to share his personal opinion on places like Twitter now about stuff. Which, again, it's not just from that interaction. I'm sure he's had negative interactions himself. But yeah, he saw. It's funny that he saw that, and it kind of inspired him to being like, "No, I'm good. I'm just like not gonna like share opinions on Twitter anymore." Like,
like just drive by is a good word for it, honestly.
Yeah, I think about it as drive by. I don't know if other people call it that, but that's how I've thought about it for a while.
Yeah, and the thing is too, like I guess for this particular, like you may not have this context entirely, or maybe on occasion, but I guess comments have always been a little bit of a drive-by situation too, because people just see a thumbnail and a title. And just essentially reply to that.
Yes, that is a thing as well. Comment sections can be a drive-by. There's like various levels, right? Like when you go smaller and smaller scale is where it's less likely to happen, right? Like on a forum, there might not be as much, but there can be if it's a big enough forum. YouTube comments, it can happen as well. Like you said, people just see the thumbnail, but it's not quite as bad as Twitter, right? Generally, it's hard to say. It's difficult to see what the cutoff is, but I think on Twitter you might get stuff boosted to the algorithm where a friend of a friend is getting into some arguments and making fun of it, and it's like, oh, if that was within a YouTube comment section, you wouldn't even be aware that conversation was happening. But on Twitter, that can be blasted your way. So
yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like I think what I would say is that like a lot of those comments usually get buried. Like if there's just a gut reaction to the thumbnail. Usually the ones that get upvoted are the ones that are like, okay, this is a better reflection of the video response at the very least. Which like for me, like I guess for lack of a better word, the negative videos I've made on the DLC, for instance, a lot of the liked comments are actually like, like, oh yeah, I'm glad someone agrees with me because I felt this too or whatever. And it was just like the early, like, people were already subbed to me for content that was essentially neutral before. Just get the video thumbnail and then they're like, oh, I'm not subscribing, this is dumb, Git Gud, all that stuff. Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. Like, that's recently what I've done is just not look at the comments for the next first few hours at the very least, so to not get a lot flooded with just gut reaction stuff. Because yeah, like my pet peeve is when people just see a thumbnail or whatever and just comment on that. When like people understand, like people know what the YouTube game is about these days. Like yeah. Like you understand, like as long as you're not outright lying about what's in the video, like I don't see a reason to get super gut reaction from stuff and comment right away. But
definitely not. Yeah, it's not appropriate. It was funny because I recently did a video sharing my opinions on why I think pausing would be fine in these games. Again, it's one of a few of more like controversial topics I've touched on. Responses were more civil than I was expecting, probably owed in part to the first half of the video being more about the technical aspects, just me explaining, being like, oh, the fact that they're online games really isn't an obstacle because here's how it would or even already does work in these games. Like it's not, you can pause online, that's fine. Just not during co-op or PvP, really, is all it comes down to. But it doesn't break any of the asynchronous stuff. I was already scripting that video, so I was going to talk about it anyways, but in the process of working on that video, there was yet another wave of discourse, right? I was just going to do it unprovoked out of the blue. I was just like, okay, the Elden Ring's DLC is coming out, so people will probably be talking about this again, so let me just make my video sharing my thoughts. But there was a big wave of a couple of people saying like, oh, this would be good as like an accessibility feature or whatever. A lot of people getting very, very mad about it. Again, this wasn't directed to me as much, but seen a lot of other people getting the Git Good response. And one of the people who was saying like, oh yeah, I think a pause would be welcome in these games, was someone who does challenge runs of these games, right? She had like videos of her fighting Millennia at like soul level 1 or rune level 1 or whatever, and like the response is like Git Good because you disagree with her on like if the game would be nicer for having a pause.
Yeah, another downside of the drive-by comment. It's like you don't know this person. They probably better than you, as far as you know.
Yeah, as a shorthand to like dismiss criticisms, Git Good is one of the most obnoxious. Like, you know, if someone just says that out of the blue to disagree, it's like just want to ban them. My whole thing for anyone who hasn't watched my video on it is just sort of like, again, I came from the perspective of I'm someone who has a weird amount of patience with these games, right? Like I'm the freak who like plays them incorrectly just to learn more about their mechanics. And I've played through all the games and I was never really like, oh, if only they had a pause button. Like it never really mattered to me that much. But it was sort of being exposed to the discourse online repeatedly and seeing all of the objections against pausing is what sort of pushed me to the other side. So I didn't come from a perspective of being like, oh, I'm salty because they don't have a pause button. I'm just like, whatever. It's not a big priority to me. But seeing all the arguments being made against it, I was just kind of like, oh, no, I don't really agree with any of this.
Yeah, it's just another gatekeep, basically. It felt like.
Yeah, that's sort of what it felt like to me. And there are some valid complaints about, at its core, changing the vibe of the game. If some people like the tension that comes from the lack of a pause. So there are rooms to have some reasonable disagreement there. But yeah, a lot of the other stuff, you know, well, they can't pause because they're online, or you know, it would make the game easier, or we already have quitting out. I'm just like, oh, no. Like I disagree with like all of these things.
And then you in that video you just factually straighten out the argument some people are trying to make who just, you know, they didn't know the game as well as they thought it did. It's like, no, you can pause this game like just naturally. It's built in already. It's just you know, that doesn't seem that way.
It sort of came from the perspective of like I've been using debug and stuff for years with these games, and I just sort of had the realization of being like, oh, I've been able to pause them in some context with outside tools, and other people haven't. And I'm just kind of like, I've had those times where like enemies are chasing after me, and I pause the game and then unpause it, and they're still attacking me, and I'm just like, oh, if this is what everyone playing the game normally was doing, they would recommend quitting out, and the enemies would have de-aggroed. I was just like, I've had moments where I was like, oh, pausing is like maintains the vibe and tension of the game better.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and so yeah, I had a sort of evolve, slowly like growing opinion over the years once I realized, like, yeah, I've paused these games plenty of times. It's fine. It's like
not only that, but I don't even know how the discussion happened when Sekiro exists. That had a pause button.
Okay, so the funny thing, some of the dissenting opinions on that, again, I don't want to be too condescending of anyone who disagrees. Like, there are valid disagreements on tension and vibe, but where to me it felt like a biggest stretch, which I really just have a hard time understanding, is when you bring up Sekiro. The fascinating thing that happens is, because there was no backlash to it adding a pause that worked, I think people sort of compartmentalized or sort of squashed the cognitive dissonance by saying, oh, well, it was okay in Sekiro because it's a different kind of game. That was the response I saw in a lot of places, and I was just sort of like, I have a hard time understanding that perspective, because it's like, yeah, it's the most different from the Souls games outside of Armored Core in that batch of games. Like, Bloodborne's a little less Souls than Elden Ring, and the rest of the Souls games, Sekiro's even a touch further out, but you can draw a Venn diagram between what a Souls game is and Sekiro, and those two circles are very close to overlapping. like they're not disparate circles, they're close to overlapping very tightly. Very similar experiences, and that was kind of funny to me. It was like, oh, Sekiro came and went without people getting upset over a pause button. So my sort of take on this is like, people get mad at the idea of adding a pause button because they think it's sort of sanitizing the game or taking away what makes them hardcore. But if they just went ahead and did it, you wouldn't actually mind it or be upset by it. And a lot of people, they don't really trust you when you put that out there. But I'm like, hey, it happened with Sekiro. It was fine.
And not only that, but like, I mean, this argument, I don't always abide by, because there's situations where, you know, you could argue just the fact that it exists can change it, but just don't use the pause button. Then, like, I don't know, like, that's,
yeah. And again,
in this case,
that's one of those things that has a gray area, right? Because it is absolutely true that the option to do something changes the vibe, right? Like, because if you have to pull on self-restraint, that can change the mood of how you interact with something. So I can definitely get, like, there are times when you say, oh, if you don't like something, don't just use it. There are times and places where, like, that's not the greatest response. But I do think that kind of works with pausing. Again, because you could always pause the Demon Souls remake because it had photo mode.
Photo mode, yeah.
And the number of times I paused the game because I needed to suddenly pause it was like once, twice, maybe. So I don't know how many people out there would actually be like step into a boss room and just start pausing constantly. I don't know. I feel like the idea that it would ruin the vibe because you would be pausing constantly, it's like it does reach a point where that's on you. I mean, I don't know that you would actually be pausing constantly just because the option existed. For me too, especially someone who does a lot more mechanics-based reviews instead of opinion. Not that my videos don't include opinion, because they do. But I think I've always been somewhat shielded. For a content creator with as many followers as I have, I've been really lucky. I've been really fortunate. Anyone else who has as many followers as I do who talks about video games probably gets a lot more negativity in their YouTube comments than I do. I think because my content is fairly chill. I'm not out here saying this game is great or this game is terrible and people are getting mad at me. I'm explaining how some obscure aspect of a video game works. And then my opinions are more along the lines of like, I wasn't really happy with it and this is how it could have been better. And, it's all pretty mild criticisms that are easy to pick apart from just the factual explanation-based parts.
So yeah, those are some of the most recent encounters IllusoryWall has had with this kind of behavior. Once again, from someone who generally doesn't share their opinion too often. And one who's very openly loves the games. Pretty much all of them to some degree. Unlike me. But the nature of the internet as it is now just doesn't include that kind of context for you. And people are too quick to the trigger with these responses when they don't even know what breadth of knowledge this one person has. Or like he said about that one challenge runner who welcomes a pause button. I mean, the secular thing aside, people quit out all the time anyway, which as we stated, which has a more of a harsh and disruptive effect on the game anyway. Yeah, that's not shunned apparently? The way we're going to look at what Phobia experienced with this behavior will be a good way to close out the video, because we've yet to fully answer the question, is this a vocal minority or not? And well, here's a little experiment we entertained that should hopefully illuminate that at a minor scale at least.
I get comments all the time that say essentially, wow, imagine using glitches to ruin your playthrough of whatever. It's like, who told you can only play it once? Where did you get this idea that a game can only be experienced one time or a movie can only be experienced one time? Yeah. Please play it again. Please watch it again. You might learn something if you do that.
Yeah, and I feel like unless someone is genuinely stuck, they're probably not going to do a route like you or me when I was doing speedrunning stuff, or they'll learn a glitch. Like to some degree, that's all more work in some cases than just doing the thing.
I mean, mostly where my channel came from was that I really enjoy replaying games. So when you put, I'm talking to a speedrunner. When you put hundreds and hundreds of hours in something, like you just find, oh, that's weird when I interact with the lever while also sprinting, and you find random shit like that. And so then it's like, ooh, what other things can I find? So then you start searching it out, and then you discover the speedrun community.
Yeah.
You're talking about it being a vocal minority.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. For example, would you like to know the percentage of people that have left a comment? This is not a hate comment. This is a comment on my glitches you can do in Bloodborne video.
How many?
It is 0.001%.
That's
you
one
talk
in
about,
like 10,000 or something?
Yeah. You talk about this being a vocal minority. It is less than 0.001% of the people. But boy, are they loud.
Yeah, I guess let me follow that thought process too. Let me see. So
that has really helped me, like, just with mental health in general and being a content creator.
Yeah.
Because most comments you get are going to be either neutral or negative.
Yeah.
Most people do not comment and say, I hope you have a great day. That's just, that's not how the internet works, right?
Yeah.
But being able to rationalize, like, no, the 99% of people that watch this are enjoying it. They're just not leaving a comment.
Yeah.
Like that actually is, like, very good and healthy, I think.
For me, the delayed attack video is it's sitting at an 81% like to dislikes. So that alone could tell you a good amount. It is currently at 60,000 views, and it's gotten 1,400 comments. So that is 2% of people leaving a comment.
So yours is quote unquote controversial.
Yeah, and even that is still just a fraction. Yeah.
2%. Yeah. Mhm.
Yep. And then let me look at one other one.
And not all those comments are hate comments.
No, actually, a good amount are receptive. That's another thing I was gonna mention too. A lot of the top comments for people who have clicked on my video are people in agreement, actually, of whatever my point is.
I didn't disagree with anything you had to say in that video.
Yep. And here, another one that's even more telling is my very first Shadow of the Erdtree video, which, as you saw it and stuff, you know that it was probably not received very well because it's also like the gut reaction of the community, essentially. People are just coming off of the high of playing it. They might not be cordial to analytical stuff necessarily.
Very true.
Yeah. So that one is not as viewed, but it has the highest dislike bar, I think, of all my videos. It's almost exactly at 50%, which is honestly quite impressive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah, it's
That's
crazy.
crazy.
Yeah. Even that one has 4% of people leaving a comment. And I do believe even that, like the top comments at the very, I mean, let me just check, I guess. Let's see. Yeah, comments.
No, when you said it had a 50% dislike, I thought you were going to tell me like, and 10% of people left a comment. 4% is still crazy.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, most people are not bad people. They're just chilling on YouTube and they watch a video and they're like, huh, and then they just click away. That's what most people do.
Yeah, I think that's what most normal people do too. Like I don't like people who just have this like gut reaction to that. Like, I mean, I can't say I've never been like, I never saw a video title and thumbnail that like annoyed me, but almost all the time, unless I think it's genuinely a toxic idea or something and I want to leave a comment, which I don't think I've necessarily even done, but almost all the time I just either don't watch it or like I watch it, I'm like, okay, I don't agree, and that's it. Or if I have a more nuanced opinion, I would at least give that nuanced opinion, not necessarily just good. And yeah, like the top comments I think are at the very least just kind of like voicing some of their critiques as well. Like they're not necessarily shedding on it. Like I don't think I shed on, like that's the thing too. Like I think a lot of people just internalize and hear what they want to hear to some degree when they see a negative skewed video. Because I don't think I ever in my videos said Shadows of the Erdtree was bad. I think I would agree with that sentiment, but I don't think that's productive at the end of the day to just say, you know, like outright, you know, like I would prefer to explain why I think something. You could argue that, but I never said it. Like people act like I am just shitting on it for the sake of it or whatever, and it's like, no, like, I know people do that, but there you go. Now, if at the end of the day, it is a vocal minority, why do I still find it harmful and want to address it? Because it's annoying, first of all. Stop. You're not impressing anyone. Secondly, hopefully people will learn from this and just moderate their behavior a little more. As I said, I do think most people who are at least willing to be more curious will probably learn this lesson, though it's doubtful that this video will reach the intended audience in that regard. But I'm also still making it for anyone else who's felt this way about the community. Trust me, you're not crazy. Thirdly, as for the critiquing angle, just closing your eyes and pretending problems don't exist isn't how things improve, just in general. I mean, we saw it in the DLC alone. A lot of problems that held back Elden Ring base were just repeated in the DLC. The overly big map with tons of empty space, the repeat bosses, all those things I mentioned. Yes, it did improve a few things here and there, like the catacomb format, but at best it is one step forward, two steps back. Basically the usual toxicity you see amongst people who don't understand that you can like something and still critique it, or if someone doesn't like something, the critique doesn't necessarily have to mean your like of something is invalid, it's just accentuated by the very specific environment Souls was raised in, where difficulty is an emphasis of the games, and thus the perception of thinking something that is difficult isn't good means you bad at game for a lot of these people. And I feel like a lot of my detractors, even if a very small vocal minority, are making me out to be some kind of hater of the series or something. As I've already stated, I've been a fan of these games roughly since Bloodborne's initial release, and while a lot of my favorite games fall on the earlier half of FromSoft's modern catalog rather than the later half, it's still a company I love. So my criticisms and comparisons to earlier games just comes from a place of me thinking, come on, I know you can do better. Of course, even if overall people are more openly critical to these things even when they like them, it's hard to say that it'll make a big difference to From Software. The sales for both Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree have been astronomical, And from my understanding, a lot of Japanese companies are generally more receptive to Japanese fans. And yes, I know that especially on the internet, it's easy to receive a lot of criticism that falls more on the hateful end rather than constructive. That's certainly a problem in itself, but the point stands, I think. I mean, I've generally seen both of these kinds in my videos from time to time. I can generally distinguish between them. Maybe it's something that requires some patience and practice on the receiving end too, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't call it out when we see it. But for anyone who needs to hear it, the world isn't as hateful as it seems sometimes.
The thing that I try to keep in mind is, like, let's say two people were talking at a party, right? You find out one person there is a big fan of Dark Souls or whatever. You would probably bond over that, right? Like, you would probably be like, oh, hey, that person, if you didn't meet them in person and you were talking to them online, could be someone you might have a heated argument with because you disagreed with them about what their favorite Souls game was, right? And so there is just sort of, and again, that's inherent to all interactions online. You can't really fault that's a broader issue than just the way a site like Twitter is being run. There could be a whole variety of reasons, but yeah, people are quick to get mad at things where they might be getting mad at people who would be friends IRL. So yeah. You know, that's something to just look out for and be wary of. You know.
And that's all for the video. If there be any interest in hearing the entire IllusoryWall and Phobia interviews, or at least a more vetted cut of it, there's a few details that were my ears only kind of thing, do let me know. The discussions together approached 4 hours in all, and there's a lot of good discussions overall. We branched down to topics that were also very insightful, but only tangentially related to the point of the video, so I didn't have a way to include them naturally. So yeah, do let me know if you want that. And I guess I should address this. Yeah, I mean, I always figured I would have a, on-camera debut type video at some point in the future. But whenever I was thinking about this video, I just realized, why not this one? So I just got a few more tools I needed, get up a little background of things I had already and stuff, and here we are. And as much as it is a little bit outside my comfort zone, I still kind of enjoyed it, outside of some technical issues I had while recording. So if you would personally like to see more of this, again, do let me know as well. I may not do it for every single video, but it would sure as hell make editing easier. I don't have to, record my voiceovers like I would normally, and then edit visuals on top of that. They kind of go hand in hand. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed that video and you learned something. It was definitely a little bit in the works for a while. It was originally going to be like a 3-week project or stuff, but I did need more time to put it together, and I didn't want to polish it thoroughly now that it became grander in scale. Originally, I was thinking it was going to be like 20-30 minute video, but I think it's obviously going to be longer than that now. I think the interviews alone maybe 30-40 minutes for what I already edited together. But I mean, yeah, that's probably, outside of potentially releasing the full interviews, my last video of the year, I think. I had to push off one to get this one finished in time, but honestly it wasn't that important. I could release it whenever either way. It wasn't as, well, let's say I wanted more references on this one rather than the other one, if anything. So we'll just see when the other one gets done, I guess. But if you did enjoy it, I would ask that you consider subscribing. You may get to see more of this in the future. I probably won't put out anything in January, as most YouTubers do, because I wouldn't mind having a break, especially after this project being a little bit bigger in scale than I thought it was, even though it wasn't that painful or anything. But I should probably have something out by February. I have a few projects already coming to mind of things I want to do, and hopefully you guys enjoy that too. I would like to thank my members who have been supporting me all this time. I did recently just lower that to literally the lowest possible price of literally $1. So for $12 you can pay for a whole year of memberships from me. If you want to join these fine fellow right here. Is that the best spot? No, right here. That's the best spot. Just feel free to join. Also reacted to Elden Ring Nightreign. It's up for members because it literally happened as I was finishing this. And as I said earlier, I do have a ton of video critiques of Shadow of the Erdtree and even some for Elden Ring base game itself. If you want to watch more stuff of mine, those kind of go into my deeper critiques of every little point I had. So you can find them all in the Elden Ring critique playlist and stuff. But yeah, in case I don't see you again for the rest of the year, have a good set of holidays, and I hope to see you again, everybody. Bye-bye.